Well, if you're with us last time, you remember we mentioned that chapters 13 through 20 are really one big section, and sadly, the big section is the consequences of David's sin. Because of his sin with Bathsheba and what Nathan the prophet told him that would happen to him. We'll flip back to that in chapter 12. Let's read those words again just to get that before us. What Nathan told David. Samuel, 2 Samuel 12, starting in verse 10. Nathan the prophet, speaking on behalf of God, said, "Now therefore the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives before your eyes and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun." And so God has made it very clear that because of David's sin, there will be consequences. Even though David does repent and the Lord puts away his sin, he is forgiven. He doesn't die immediately as he deserved to die, but there's still going to be consequences. And so we've seen that really in chapter, you see it immediately with the death of his child with Bathsheba, but then starting in 13 and all the way till the end of tonight with chapter 20, you just see consequences. I mean, you can't go back and rediscuss all that we saw, but we stopped somewhere along the way in chapter 15, and you have the rebellion of Absalom. You remember Absalom is one of David's sons, and Absalom killed his brother Amnon because Amnon raped their sister Tamar, and so it's already just a really bad situation, very, very bad family consequences because of what David has done. But we stopped somewhere around verse 30 last time. Absalom he's gathered up a group of people who were ready to support him as king. You remember he was standing in the city gates and he was currying favor with all the people and saying, "Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if I were king and I could serve you," and all that sort of stuff. And so now he's actually got a rebellion going, and David recognizes, hey, this is a problem. I need to flee. I need to get outside of the city, because if I get bottled up inside the city of Jerusalem and they circle the city, then we're done for. And so we saw David leaving. Verse 30 and 31 in there, David was going up the Mount of Olives, and everybody's weeping. It's like a big funeral procession there. And so David hears at that time, we had already seen it in the text, but David is told in verse 31 that Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Now remember, Ahithophel, we're going to see him again tonight, that's Bathsheba's grandfather. And so you can imagine he's probably still not very happy about everything that David has done. And so Ahithophel, who was a wise counselor for David, as was a trusted man of David, as we'll see later tonight, his counsel was viewed as being almost the words of God themselves. And yet Ahithophel has now betrayed. He's gone over, he's swapped sides, and he's siding with Absalom. And so David prays at the end of verse 31, "Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness." And we see that prayer is answered even there in verse 32. We meet this guy named Hushai. And one preacher said that David's new hymn should be, "What a friend we have in Hushai," because Hushai is going to be David's inside man there in Jerusalem. So David and his people are leaving. They know that Absalom and his party are coming back to Jerusalem. Remember, David has left a few of the virgins there to care for the house, to take care of the house. And he sent the priests back with the Ark of the Covenant, because David says, if the Lord has favor, then he'll bring me back. But if he doesn't want to bring me back, then he's just not going to bring me back. But David's not going to use the Ark of the Covenant like a good luck charm. Sometimes, you remember we saw that in 1 Samuel, the way they used the Ark of the Covenant like a lucky rabbit's foot. And so David says, we're not going to do that. And so he's got a few people back there in Jerusalem. But there in verses 32 through 37, you see this guy, Hushai. And he's David's friend. The text is really clear about that. Verse 37 calls him Hushai, David's friend. And so David says, look, I appreciate your loyalty. You could go with me, but that probably wouldn't be the best for us. But you could be a blessing if you stayed in Jerusalem. And as you hear things, you're going to be living in the king's house, and Absalom's house. Let him think that you're there to serve him. And when you hear things, pass it along to the priests. Pass it to Zadok and Abiathar, and they'll eventually get word back to me. And so you see this little spy ring, this intelligence network that David is forming even as he's fleeing from the city. Verse 37 there says, Hushai, David's friend, came into the city just as Absalom was entering into Jerusalem. One commentator has pointed out that if you look at the map really closely, it seems like there's only about one hill between David and Absalom. David and his people are fleeing. They've just made it over the hill, and here comes Absalom and his people coming into the city. And so even being that close with David and Absalom, it's clear that the Lord is still with David. We've seen that refrain there in Samuel. The Lord is with him. The Lord is with him. And so the Lord is protecting David even in the midst of these consequences for his sin. Well, you make your way into chapter 16. I'm going to try to give us some of the big picture elements and not get too bogged down, or else we'll never get done tonight. But in chapter 16, you could say that the dark shadow of Saul shows up again. This cloud of Saul shows up for David. Because here in verses 1 through 4, you get a servant of Saul's son. All right? So you remember, or grandson actually, Mephibosheth is Saul's grandson. And so right now the scene is focusing on David. Absalom's back there in the city. But Mephibosheth comes, and it's actually his servant Ziba. Verse 2 says, the king said to Ziba, why have you brought these things? So Ziba has brought a couple of donkeys that have all kinds of bread and raisins and fruit and wine. He's bringing refreshments. He's got the food supply, and he's bringing it to David. But David is a little bit suspicious. Verse 2, he asks, why have you brought these things? And then in verse 3, he says, where is your master's son? Where's the boss? Where's Mephibosheth? And Mephibosheth, that story was back in chapter 9, where David showed graciousness to Saul's offspring. Mephibosheth was the only one who was left. And David had promised Jonathan that he would take care of him and his family. And so David has been faithful to Mephibosheth, but now here comes his servant. And the servant Ziba, he lies. Verse 3, it says, he remains in Jerusalem, for he said, today the house of Israel will give me back the kingdom of my father. Well, that's Ziba's story. We're going to follow along later tonight and find out if that was actually truthful or not. But just think about that for a minute. Ziba, the servant, he wants David to think that Mephibosheth, whom David has shown the utmost kindness and graciousness to, that Mephibosheth has secretly been harboring this desire to really become king again, just like his grandfather Saul. And so now he thinks that somehow, because Absalom is leading a rebellion, David's son's leading a rebellion, then Saul's grandson will become king again. Well, we recognize that doesn't make a lot of sense. That doesn't sound like the right thing. But David is, obviously he's constrained right now, and he makes a snap decision. So he says in verse 4, all that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours. David had been very gracious and had given Mephibosheth lots of land and belongings. He's saying, now it all belongs to you, Ziba. Well, that's just from Saul's grandson's servant. But now in verses 5 and following, you get one of Saul's family members. He shows up. Think about how many years have passed. We're just reading through this, but decades have passed. Saul has been dead for several decades, and David can't get away from the shadow of Saul. Here comes verse 5, when King David came to Bahurim, there came a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei. And as he came, he cursed continually. And he's throwing these stones at David and his servants, and they're going along the way. They just can't get away. Shimei keeps following them. Verse 7, he's cursing, get out, you man of blood, you worthless man. The Lord has avenged on you all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. And the Lord has given the kingdom into the hand of your son, Absalom. See, your evil is on you, for you are a man of blood. Shimei is calling out to David in front of all of his servants and his men. He's saying, you have come to your ruin. Shimei is viewing Absalom as the new king. He's saying, hey, this is a done deal. You're out, David, and you're getting what you deserve. Well, verse 9, Abishai. Now, I know there's a lot of names here. Abishai is Joab's brother. Joab is the commander of the army. We're going to see a lot of Joab tonight. But Abishai is his brother, and he's just as hot-headed. He says, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and take off his head. You know, if the head's taken off, then it can't curse anymore. So that's what he's going for. He's hot-headed and he is ready to go kill him. Abishai is the one who wanted to kill Saul back in the cave in 1 Samuel 26. And so he's always saying, hey, look, now's your chance. You need to strike while the iron is hot. And so Abishai wants to kill Shimei, but David says, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? Why do you people keep causing me trouble? And notice David's attitude. He says, if he is cursing because the Lord has said to him, curse David, who then shall say, why have you done so? He said, maybe God sent him to do this. Maybe he's right. Verse 11, David sent to Abishai and to all his servants, behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now may this Benjaminite? If my own son is seeking to kill me, why wouldn't this guy be cursing me? Leave him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. It may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing today. So David doesn't defend himself, and he doesn't deny. He doesn't start trying to plead his case. He just says, leave it alone. Maybe God sent him, maybe he didn't. Let's let God handle it. But through this, David recognizes that, okay, maybe some of what Shimei is saying is not true. He's making these claims that David has been really bloodthirsty as it concerns the house of Saul, and we've seen how he was gracious to Mephibosheth. And so maybe Shimei is wrong. But David also remembers he has spilled blood. He spilled Uriah's blood. He spilled the blood of others. And so maybe some of those words hit home a little more than Shimei even imagined. And so David entrusts himself to the Lord. He says, let God take care of it. But I love somebody pointing this out. He said, just because David trusted the Lord, the criticism didn't stop. They keep going along the way, and Shimei keeps going along the hillside with them the whole way. He's cursing every step. He's throwing stones, flinging dust. The criticism doesn't stop, but David has entrusted himself to the Lord. Well, those two scenes there, they've focused on David, but now we shift back to Absalom there in Jerusalem. Verse 15 and following, they come back to Jerusalem, and Ahithophel is with him. And when Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, comes to Absalom, Hushai says to Absalom, long live the king, long live the king. Now notice, he doesn't say which king. You got to pay really close attention here. Because what is Hushai supposed to be doing? He's supposed to be making Absalom think, hey, I'm on your side. I used to be really close with David, but now I've switched. I'm going to be faithful to you, Absalom. But he's not lying. He just says, long live the king. The question is, which king? Who is he really supporting? And Absalom, he knows that Hushai was close to David. He says, is this your loyalty to your friend? Why do you not go with your friend? Twice he emphasizes, hey, you are David's friend. Why are you doing this? And Hushai says, no, for whom the Lord and his people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. And again, whom shall I serve? Should it not be his son? As I have served your father, so I will serve you. Now, Absalom is so prideful. Again, he doesn't stop and pay attention to what Hushai is saying. Because Hushai never explicitly says, I support you, Absalom. Look at it again, verse 18. For whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel have chosen. Who did the Lord choose to be Israel's king?
David.
Who did the people choose to be Israel's king?
David.
And so he's not saying, hey, I'm supporting you. I'm supporting the one that the Lord chose and the one that the people chose. And I'm going to support him and I'm going to serve him even by serving you. So the way that he's serving Absalom, he's actually serving David because he is a double agent, if you want to think of it in that way. But Absalom is so prideful, he doesn't notice that Hushai is being very ambiguous. And so Absalom welcomes Hushai into his confidence. So Absalom's now, he's got two advisors. He's got Ahithophel, who was a trusted advisor of David, and he's clearly changed sides and is supporting Absalom. But he's also got this the support and the counsel of Hushai now. So he's got two people to choose from, two sources of wisdom. Well, Ahithophel says to Absalom, here's what you need to do. You need to go in and sleep with your father's concubines, the ones that he left here to take care of his house there in Jerusalem. And he's essentially saying not that everybody in Jerusalem is going to watch it, but that everybody in Jerusalem is going to hear about it. It's going to go viral. It's going to hit social media. Everybody's going to know about it. Everybody will know that Absalom, he has clearly broken ties with his father. Sleeping with the king's concubines is an assertion of yourself as king. And so that's what Ahithophel's first piece of advice to him is to do that. Now again, remember who Ahithophel is. That's Bathsheba's grandfather. He's probably still not very happy about what happened with Bathsheba. And so that might help us understand a bit of his advice there. But in doing this, it's a coup, but it's a bloodless coup. It's a way to take over without spilling a drop of blood. But perhaps Ahithophel is really pushing this eye for an eye, and that David has slept with Ahithophel's granddaughter, and so now Absalom should treat his father's concubines in the same way. Verse 23, it says, "In those days the counsel that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed both by David and by Absalom." So you can see he's held in high regard. And so Absalom has one really prime candidate. Hey, this is my counselor. This is the guy I should listen to. But the chapter division is not helpful there, because it still just continues into chapter 17. It's still this idea of getting advice. What should Absalom do to take over as king? And so Ahithophel gives more advice, and he essentially says, let me raise up an army, and I will go and chase David, and I'm going to come upon him, and I'm only going to strike David. And when everybody sees that he's dead, I will bring all the people back to you. Verse 3, as a bride comes home to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and all the people will be at peace. So Ahithophel says, look, if David is gone, if he's out of the picture, who else are they going to turn to? You're their only other option as king. So if we get rid of David, then I'll bring all the people back to you as a bride coming home to her husband. Well, verse 4 says, the advice seems right in the eyes of Absalom and all the elders of Israel. Sounds like a good idea. But he's got Hushai over here. He's got somebody else he can ask advice of. And so he calls Hushai, and Hushai comes in and gives him the opportunity to speak. And Hushai hears what Ahithophel has said. And Hushai says, this time, verse 7, the counsel that Ahithophel has given is not good. He says, look, I know he's had a long, a successful running streak. He's been a good counselor for a long time. But this time he's giving you a dud. It's not good counsel. You don't need to listen to him. In verse 8, Hushai starts talking, and if you had a chance to read ahead, or if not, take the time to read it later, he's really flowery. He's stalling. That's what he's doing. He's trying to buy time by really making his proposal take up a lot of time. And he just talks about how wonderful a warrior David is. And look, if everybody hears something happens to David, then they're going to rise up. Their hearts will grow strong. And look, you don't need to. Excuse me, I just lost my train of thought altogether there. He's saying David's a warrior, and so you need to send out all sorts of people and to come around them and conquer David. But verse 11, he really gets to his advice at that point. Verses 8 through 10, he's just stalling. He's just buying time. But verse 11, but my counsel is that all Israel be gathered to you, from Dan to Beersheba, as the sand by the sea for multitude, and that you go to battle in person. So Ahithophel said, let me raise an army. I'll go out and lead the army. But now Hushai says, no, you need to be in charge of the army. You need to be front and center. Well, we've seen Absalom's vanity. We've seen his pridefulness. You can imagine he likes the sound of that. He likes the image of him being at the front of the army, and he's going to be in charge. Everybody will see him in battle. And so Hushai's suggestion is, look, you need to go out and lead the army. And if he comes somewhere and we find him, we're going to make sure that he's dead. But if he goes into a city, verse 13, we're not just going to destroy him. We'll destroy the whole city. So Hushai has a very different plan. It requires more people, and it puts Absalom right at the front of the battle. But look at verse 14, and then we're going to compare the ideas. Verse 14, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, the counsel of Hushai the Archite is better than the counsel of Ahithophel. For the Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. So, you got these two plans here. They both come from trusted advisors, good counselors. And when the people, back in verse 4, when they heard Ahithophel's idea, they thought it sounded pretty good. Until they hear Hushai's plan. And then they think, well, that sounds pretty good. And so, ultimately, we see that the Lord had already ordained, he had planned to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel so that the Lord might bring harm, he might bring justice upon Absalom. So the narrator tells us that Ahithophel's plan was actually the right plan. That's what he should have done. The plan that would say, let's go out and get David only and not bring harm, not fight everybody else, only focus on David. But Hushai said, no, we're going to have a scorched earth policy until we find David. Anybody that gets in our way is going to die. But the Lord has already planned to defeat Absalom through defeating the good counsel of Ahithophel. Well, Hushai, remember, he's working for David, and he doesn't know the outcome. He doesn't know what Absalom's going to choose, and so he passes the word on to the priest, to the spy ring. It's always good when you've got a priest in your spy ring. And so he says to Zadok and Abiathar, he says, look, this is what Ahithophel has told Absalom. Here's what I've told Absalom to do. I'm not even sure what the answer is going to be yet, but you need to let David know that he can't sleep tonight where he's at. He's got to get across the river. And so Hushai passes the word to the spies. And you see in verse 17, it tells you how this works. There's two men named Jonathan and Ahimaaz. Again, that's a different Jonathan, not Saul's son Jonathan. He's dead. But there's these two men, and they're waiting in a certain place, and there's a female servant that's supposed to go and tell them, because they can't be seen in the city. And then once they get the word, they'll go and pass the word on to David. So you see how it's supposed to work there. The problem is somebody spotted them. Somebody sees them. Verse 19, this woman hides them in the well of a man at Bahurim, and she covers the top of the well, and then she puts grain on the top of it so you can't even tell that there's a well there. And so when servants come from Absalom and they want to know, hey, have you seen these two guys? She says, they've gone over there. Go chase for them. They went that way. And so you wonder the question, is she lying? Yes, she's very clearly lying. Does the Lord approve of lying? No. Can the Lord do whatever he wants to do? Absolutely. So I think this is a good example of seeing how the Lord works all things together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. So even though this is not the method, God is not condoning lying, but God is working even through that. And so she tells them they went that way, and then after the men are gone, and they get up and they go on their way to pass the word to David. So David and his men arise, verse 22, so that they can cross the Jordan. So by daybreak, it says not one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. But then you get to verse 23. It's very interesting. When Ahithophel, again that's Uriah's, Bathsheba's grandfather, when he saw that his good counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey, he went off home to his own city, he set his house in order and hanged himself. And he died and was buried in the tomb of his father. Now I have all kinds of questions about that, and ultimately it doesn't tell us why he's done what he's done. Is it possible that now he foresees that Absalom is going to be defeated? And he's cast his lot with Absalom. And so if Absalom is defeated and now David's back at being king, then Ahithophel knows he's going to be held to account. It's just a matter of time before he's executed. And so we've seen that many times in history. Somebody thinks they're about to be executed, and so they commit suicide. Of course, when we hear of a hanging, who else does that make us think of in the Bible that went out and hung himself? Judas. And so it's easy to quickly say, well, Ahithophel's just the Old Testament Judas, and he's just worthless so-and-so. Maybe, but everything we've known up until this point is that he's been a good counselor to David. And somebody has suggested, and I think it may be a good way to understand it, Ahithophel seems to be a good man, but he can't stand the grace that has been shown to David. God has chosen David, and God has forgiven David, and even though David is going through horrible consequences for his sin, David's still alive. David's still king, and God has promised that David and his offspring will reign forever. And it's possible that Ahithophel just can't stomach that. And he's trying to cast his lot with Absalom because he doesn't think David should be king. And when he sees that Absalom is most likely going to be defeated, he takes his own life. But some have suggested that it's because he just can't stand the grace that God has shown to David. Well, any questions or thoughts so far? We're still a long way to go, but anything you want to ask about or add as we...
Where's Bathsheba's dad at?
That's a good question. I don't know. I don't think we're ever told who. I think we are told who his father is, but I don't think he shows up in the story.
Seems like he ought to be there.
He's probably dead, I would have to think. Otherwise, maybe he would figure it.
I don't even know who that is. That don't even mention. But my man's all that good anyway.
Well, it's one of those where you got to do the cross references, and I'm flipping here. We're told he's one of David's mighty men, and his name.
Everybody put him out front of another battle, get in.
They found the rascal.
Didn't like loose ends.
Eliam. Eliam is the son of Ahithophel, but I don't remember Eliam coming up in the story anywhere. He's mentioned in chapter 23 in the list of mighty men. And so when we talked about Bathsheba, we discussed how, hey, she wasn't just some nobody out there. David knew her father and grandfather and all this sort of stuff. But as to what happens to him, we're just not told that part of the story. Well, David is still on the run. And so, verse 24 says, Then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. But look what Absalom does. Verse 25, Absalom had set Amasa over the army instead of Joab. So Joab has been David's commander-in-chief, commander of the armed forces. And Absalom says, no, we're not doing that. We're going to have a different guy. But they're all related. So Amasa is David's nephew. Joab, I believe, is also his nephew, but a different side of the family.
There was David cousin.
Cousins, is that right? Yep.
And there was David was his uncle, and they was Absalom cousin.
Right. I think that, so that would make Absalom David's nephew because David's his uncle. But then Amasa, I think, is a great nephew, which would make David his great uncle. So again, they're all connected here, but because they have different brothers and sisters and sometimes different parents, only one parent is in common.
You know, we'll say that they got, there's one man over here, I don't know who is. Itra.
Oh yeah, Amasa was the son of a man named Itra, the Ishmaelite, who married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And that's, earlier he said, you sons of Zeruiah. Y'all are making me remember. I think that's David's sister, Zeruiah. Well, her name has come up before. I think that's who she was.
I don't remember that.
Like I say, sometimes this is where a good study Bible helps because they've done all the cross references.
There and there's some markers if you want to draw up the tree.
Well, I started something like that in pencil here, but I only put the first initial so I wouldn't have to spell out the names. So now I can't remember what the names are. But I've got written back here earlier, chapter 14, verse 1, where it says, Joab, the son of Zeruiah. I remember that's David's nephew. So again, just different, they're nephews, but that doesn't mean that Amasa and Joab are brothers. So Absalom has a different commander of the army. That's going to play into the rest of the story. And then you look at the end of 17, verses 27 and 28, you've got a list of a couple of names there, but the name I want to draw your attention to, at the end of verse 27, Barzillai, the Gileadite. He's going to come up again, but we see here in verse 27, he's brought all kinds of food. Verse 28, he brought beds and basins and earthen vessels, wheat and barley and flour and parched grains and beans and lentils, honey and curds and sheep and cheese from the herd, for David and the people with him to eat, for they said the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. So Barzillai is a rich man who brings supplies for David and his fleeing army. So right now, David is a king without a capital. He's on the run, and his competitor is his own son. Well, in verse chapter 18, that's where the battle is really going to heat up. Verses 1 through 5, chapter 18, you get a battle plan. You see there in verse 1, David musters an army. Verse 2, he sends out an army. And he tells them at the end of the verse, I myself will go out with you. Remember what was the root of David's problem back in chapter 11?
Stay home.
It was springtime when the kings go out to war, and he stayed at home. And so he says, I will go out with you. But the men say, no, not on your life. You'd be better to us if you send us help, if you give us advice, you give us orders. But you are worth 10,000 of us. They say there in the middle of verse 3, it's not worth it for you to go out into battle. So verse 4, the king said to them, whatever seems best to you, I will do. So he stands by the side of the gate while all his armies march out by hundreds and by thousands. Here's the one command. If he's so valuable, he's got to stay back at home and just send them orders and tell them what to do. Here's the one order that we're told about. Verse 5, his one command, the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. All the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. So the one thing David wants them to keep in mind above everything else, don't harm Absalom. And he calls him young man Absalom. 4 times in this chapter is Absalom referred to as the young man Absalom. And again, this raises all sorts of questions for us. We wonder, is this fatherly love? Is it fatherly guilt? Does he view Absalom as this just a child whose sins should be overlooked? Or is David remembering, hey, it's because of my sin that all of this has come about? Now we know Absalom is certainly guilty for his own sins, but we also know David's family is being ripped apart because of his sin with Bathsheba. So his priority is not the preservation of the kingdom, it's deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. Well, we've been talking about Absalom for several chapters, and we know it's all been building to a head here. And you get verses 6 through 8, you get the actual battle, and it just doesn't take very long. It doesn't. The way the Bible does so often, it tells you everything leading up to it, but it doesn't tell you a lot about the battle. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David, and the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people than the sword. That tells you they're on rough terrain. It was deadlier to go through that area than it was to actually fight with David's men, which is probably why David tried to and sought to have the battle right there so that the terrain would work in their favor. But then it gets interesting, verse 9. It says, Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. He just so happened to. He was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. Now, we've just seen in verse 8 the battle is the terrain is so bad, it's deadlier to go through there, and Absalom's trying to make his way through, and it's not entirely clear, is he looking back over his shoulder and not paying attention and gets caught up in it that way? Or is his hair? You remember we got that detail about his hair earlier on. His hair was so beautiful. He was like a shampoo model, and they weighed his hair every year when he cut his hair every time he went to market once a year to get a big haircut. And so maybe his hair is getting caught up in the tree. But either way, there he is, Absalom the rebel, hanging, suspended between heaven and earth. Now at this point, you're thinking, well, what happens next? The guy's hanging in the tree. We got to hear the rest of the story. But the narrator is building tension. He doesn't immediately tell us. He changes the subject. Verse 10, he says, a certain man saw it and told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Well, you want to know, who is this man and what happened to Absalom? But no, we get the conversation between this unknown man and Joab. And Joab is outraged. Look at verse 11. He says, what? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. The man said to Joab, even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. And on the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there's nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Do you hear what he's saying? It's not worth all the money in the world to defy the king. The king would hear about it, he would have my head. And you're acting, Joab, like you would have defended me. I know you would not have defended me. You would have stood back and watched my execution. And Joab doesn't respond. He just says, I won't waste any more time like this with you. I won't argue with you. Have you ever been in an argument with somebody like that when they don't want to deal with the facts, and so they just say, I'm done. I'm not going to talk about it any further. Joab had heard exactly what David said. He knew that David said, don't harm, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. But Joab doesn't care. And so we see verse 14, he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Some commentators want to try to figure out, well, what's the significance of the 3? Wasn't one enough? And I really don't know. Was Absalom just mad saying, oh, this is for this, and this is because you burned my field, and this is because you did that? But the fact that he's involving other people there in verse 15 seems to make it, Joab is trying to make it seem like that this is an execution by everybody, not just him. It's not just a one-on-one between Joab and Absalom. Everybody's involved, almost like it's an execution. Either way, Absalom is very much dead. Verse.
Then he's got 10 men with him.
Yeah, I mean, they not only did javelins, but they the rest of it. He must have been hacked up pretty good.
Yeah.
But then 10 will tell.
Absolutely.
You think? Particularly when the king starts asking who did it.
Right, and we've seen before that David doesn't respond well when people come back and say, hey, I did you a favor, I killed your enemy, and David never responds well to that. And so those are good questions. Those are good intuitions, because you wonder, what's David going to do when he finds out? Well, Joab blows the trumpet and basically said, hey, the battle's over. And so they came back, they stopped chasing Israel because Joab says, no, we got what we came for. And it's so poignant and sad, because verse 17, they took Absalom, they threw him into a great pit in the forest, and they raised over him a great heap of stones. Hang on to that idea. All Israel fled, everyone to his own home. Verse 18 is kind of a side note or a footnote in Absalom's life. Now, Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. He called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. So we read about Absalom's sons. We got a list of his names earlier, a few chapters back, but clearly they didn't live. And so Absalom has no heir. And so he said, just so I'll be remembered, I'm going to build a monument to myself. It's never a good idea if you're building a monument to yourself. And Absalom does that. And so you got this big fancy monument, but the narrator is saying, no, the real monument is that in verse 17, that great heap of stones where they buried him in the pit in the forest. So you have the end of Absalom's life and his monument. Well, that phrase there at the end of verse 17, all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. So that means, the smoke is just now clearing. The battle is over because Absalom's dead, and we're going to come back to that idea here in a little bit. But just as you're probably wondering, the narrator wants us to focus on what's going to happen when David hears about it. So verse 19, Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok, said, let me run and carry the news to the king.
That guy's crazy.
Yeah. Well, and that's, you automatically, why would you want to do that?
Yeah, I was going to say, doesn't he know the track record?
Yeah. Well, so he's the same guy that back in chapter 17, those 2 spies who were supposed to be taking the news to David, remember that was Jonathan and this guy, Ahimaaz, and that didn't turn out too well. They wound up hiding down in the well. So maybe he's thinking, now's my chance to redeem myself. I can really show off, and I'll come through and save the day. But Joab says to him, you are not to carry news today. You may carry news another day, but today you shall carry no news, because the king's son is dead. Then Joab said to the Cushite, we're not even told who the Cushite is, go and tell the king what you have seen. It almost sounds like this guy is expendable. He can go, and if David gets mad at him and kills him, that's fine. So here goes this Cushite, and he bows and runs. And Ahimaaz, he says again, come what may, let me also run after the Cushite. Joab said, why? Why will you run, my son, seeing that you will have no reward for the news? Very clear. Nobody's expecting a great reward when they tell David. Verse 23, come what may, I will run. Well, this is foolishness. But you think, well, this guy, he just sounds like he's big and bad. He's going to do it. And it says Ahimaaz ran by the way of the plain, and he outran the Cushite. So maybe they're taking two different paths. One on the plain, one over the mountain, one going over the hard terrain, one going the straight path that's a little bit longer. But Ahimaaz outruns him. He gets there first. So now the scene shifts to David, and he's sitting at the gates. Remember, that's where Absalom was at when he was currying favor as king. He's at the gates. And the last time we saw David at the gate was when he was sending his armies out into battle. And so now he's waiting for news from the battle. What are they going to say? And the watchman's up on the wall, and he sees this man running. And David tells him, verse 25, if he's alone, that means there's news in his mouth. And so they see this lone runner, and he's coming closer and closer. But then the watchman sees another man running alone. And the king says he also brings news. Well, 27, the watchman says, I think the running of the first is like the running of Ahimaaz, the son of Zadok. Now, that really makes me wonder, did he have a funny run? Did he dress different? How did they know, hey, I think that's Ahimaaz coming? But either way, they seem to recognize him. And David hears that, and he says, he's a good man. He comes with good news. David's certainly hoping that that's going to be true. He's a good man. He comes with good news. But Ahimaaz comes, and he gets cold feet. He says, all's well. He bows before the king, and blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered up the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. And David asked him, is it well with the young man Absalom? And he answers, when Joab sent the king's servant, your servant, I saw a great commotion, but I don't know what it was. He gets cold feet. He can't even tell the news that he outran the Cushite just to get there to tell. The king said, turn aside, stand here. So he did. He turned aside and stood still. He's essentially worthless at that point. If you have no news, why are you coming here to show up and act like you have news? But here comes the Cushite. Cushite says, good news from my lord the king. For the Lord Yahweh has delivered you this day from the hand of all who rose up with you. The king said to the Cushite, is it well with the young man Absalom? There's that same question. And the Cushite answers, watch what he says. May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. Does he ever directly say what happens to Absalom? But is it very clear that Absalom's dead? He's saying, may all the other enemies be just like that young man, which is dead.
Yeah.
But he never says Absalom's name. He doesn't even make it clear explicitly, but David knows what he's saying. The king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. We see David in deep grief here. And we've seen David around lots of deaths of other people. And this one stands out because think back when Saul died and Jonathan died. David wrote a eulogy. He wrote a beautiful hymn, a beautiful tribute to Saul and Jonathan. He was not speechless. But when Bathsheba's son died, the son that he had fathered with Bathsheba, he had words to say. He said, I can't go to him. He can't come to me, but I will go to him. He had something to say. When Amnon, his other son, one of his other sons, was murdered by Absalom, David was filled with rage. But now when Absalom dies, David is filled with grief. And all he can do is just kind of babble my son Absalom, my son Absalom. You know, it gets interesting when we try to interpret Old Testament narratives with New Testament clarity, because we start thinking in terms of the New Testament, okay, who's saved and who's lost and who's going to hell. We think in those terms, and sometimes it's not as clear as we would like for it to be in the Old Testament. But many would argue that because Absalom has rejected God's anointed king, who's his father David, because he's rejected God's anointed, that means he's rejected God. And so many would look at the death of Absalom and say, yes, this is a lost person. This is someone who's cursed. He's going to be in hell. And that would help us understand the difference in David's response. Because when this infant died, David says, oh, he can't come back to me, but I will go to him. I will see him again on the last day. But Absalom, he's done. He's eternally separated from Absalom forever. That's the way at least many people would understand that. Absalom's eternal fate is that he has rejected God and rejected God's anointed. Well, again, the chapter divisions aren't the most helpful, because you might think, all right, well, let's change the story. Chapter 19, no, you still have David in deep grief. And Joab, he apparently gets back at some point, and Joab hears the king is weeping and mourning for Israel. So watch what happens. Verse 2, the victory that day was turned into mourning. They won the battle. They should be rejoicing. That's what you would expect. All the town, everybody should be rejoicing. They've had victory in battle. But because of the way David is carrying on and mourning, all the people hear that the king is grieving for his son. And so verse 3, the people stole into the city that day as people still in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. This is not the way it's supposed to be. The king covers his face, and the king cries with a loud voice, oh, my son, Absalom. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son. David has a grief that is even greater than gratitude. God has saved the nation, but David is not even focused on that. He's not expressing thanksgiving and gratitude to God. He's just filled with grief. Again, we probably all have questions as fathers and husbands, and we think about the family implications. What is going through David's mind as he's thinking about the death of his son Absalom? But Joab hears all of this, and if you haven't noticed up until this point, Joab seems to be a no-nonsense kind of guy. Even though he's certainly not king, he has no problem being very blunt with the king, his uncle. And Joab comes into the house to the king, and he says, and he just goes on this long speech here from verses 5 through 8 there. And his words are designed to really shock David back into reality. He says, you've today covered with shame the faces of all your servants. These are the servants who saved this day your life and the lives of your sons and the lives of your daughters, saved your life, the lives of your wives, your concubines, because, verse 6, you love those who hate you and hate those who love you. Another way that could be interpreted is because you are loyal to those who are disloyal to you, and you are disloyal to those who are loyal to you. That may help that make a little more sense. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. Well, these people went out there and put their lives on the line for you, David, and this is how you repay them. You're mourning so severely, the whole town has heard that the victory has been turned into mourning because of the way you're acting. You continue there in the middle of verse 6. You have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead today, then you would be pleased. Now, that might be a little far. I don't think David would be rejoicing if the rest of them were dead, even if Absalom were alive. He would certainly mourn the death of his people, but this is how he's acting, and this is how he's making the people interpret his actions. That David would rather have Absalom alive and the rest of them dead. In verse 7, now therefore arise, get up, go out, and speak kindly to your servants, for I swear by Yahweh. He's invoking the Lord's name here. If you do not go, not a man will stay with you this night. And this will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. Now we think back to Nathan's confrontation with David, and we think, okay, well here's another scene where somebody really just has to come and give David some straight talk and just help him see what's going on. But then in that last verse there where Joab takes a vow, and he's saying, nobody's going to stay with you. Everybody's going to defeat you. This is going to be worse than anything that's happened. I read that as a bit of a threat. Joab is promising David, if you don't get it together, I'm taking these men. There's nobody who's going to stay with you this night. It will be worse for you than all the evil that has come upon you from your youth until now. I think Joab has a little bit too much power. He's not the king, but in some ways he has more authority than the king, because he's running the army and he's telling David, if you don't do what I want you to do, then this isn't going to end well for you. So it seems like a bit of a threat there to David. But we understand that there's also some truth and validity to what Joab is saying to him. Well, David hears, and so Joab's words work. They have their intended effect. And the king, David gets up, he takes his seat at the gate. Again, that's kind of, it'd be like us saying he went to the courthouse or he went to the presidential mansion. He went to where he's supposed to be. And the king here, behold, the king is sitting in the gate. All the people came before the king. All of that's been the response of David to the death of Absalom. Do you have any commentary, thoughts, questions about that?
Joab, we call that a come to Jesus talk.
Yeah.
And he, you know, and it might have just been, I think Joab knows the God has got David on what behind David. And I think you think he's got an ulterior motive, threatening, and I feel like maybe he's telling this here to shock him, to make him realize, I mean, he's going through this mourning period, and this is, you know, a slap in the face type.
Yeah, for sure.
Get up and go do what you're supposed to do.
Absolutely. No, I agree with all of that. And part of why I say the thing about the threat is because we're going to see more of Joab before this is all over, where Joab clearly is going too far. And so maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it's almost like, hey, it'd been good if you stopped at the end of verse 6, Joab. But then when you throw in verse 7, it's almost like you took it a little too far. Because it sounds like it's almost Joab is threatening David, or if nothing else, he's just saying, look, the people are going to follow me. They're going to follow me, David, so you need to get it together, or else I'm taking them and I'm gone. And we're going to see again, Joab pretty much does whatever he wants to do, and if it aligns with David, then that's good for David. But if it doesn't align with David's will, then Joab just does whatever he wants to do. I mean, he's killed the king's son, and the king was very clear and explicit that that's not what's supposed to happen. But again, you want to get really make your head start to hurt. Back up to what did we see about what God was doing in the midst of all this in chapter 17, verse 14? The Lord had ordained to defeat the good counsel of Ahithophel, so that the Lord might bring harm upon Absalom. We understand Absalom deserves to be judged. He absolutely is under the condemnation of God, and God is working through sinful people to bring about his justice. And so sometimes when we see how God does that, we think only God could pull that off. Only God could accomplish it the way that he has.
To me, I think you see in David here the human conflict that you have when he's been struggling mightily with all these interfamily issues and interfamily problems.
Mm-hmm.
He knows he's responsible for a good bit, if not all of it.
Mm-hmm.
He loves his son, and it's hard. I think it's hard for him to come to grips with the fact that Absalom is really and truly his enemy, but yet he's just conflicted.
Absolutely.
I mean, I would hate to be in that position. Again, you see humanity. I mean, all these characters in the Bible display their humanity, and I think David is displaying his humanity here. He needs a little shock treatment, and I think Joab is the appropriate party, I guess, to give it to him, kind of snap him out of it. But certainly I can understand David's
Yeah.
feelings, I mean, the way David responds. You know, we'd like to say that, you know, he should have seen Absalom as his enemy and Absalom got what he deserved, but sometimes it's hard to do that.
For sure. I think, as you were saying that, it brought to my mind Queen Elizabeth and her children and her duties as a monarch. And we expect this a little bit of presidents, but it's different because kings and queens last as long as they live in England. That certainly there's that family side of it, that you have feelings. She was a mother, and she had how she felt as a mother about her children, but then she's the queen. She's the leader of the nation. And so just as David is supposed to be serving the people, she had times when she was supposed to do that. And there's times when you look at history and you think, why in the world did you not jerk a knot in your children and get, you know, we won't go down that road, but there's times when you can think about, you wonder why didn't you respond differently? But it's that tension of someone who's a parent but also has responsibilities of oversight. And so David is supposed to be king. He's supposed to be leading the people. And the people very clearly see, hey David, you care more about this rebel that has tried to kill you, who's trying to take the kingdom from you. He was plotting to kill you. We've gone out and put our lives on the line, and this is how you repay us, is that you say, you know, you're weeping and mourning. And again, anybody who has half a heart can imagine and understand some of the grief that David is going through. But ultimately, he's got to rise and be king. That's what God has called him to do, and that's what the people have hired him to do. If you want to put it that way, he's supposed to be serving them as king. Well,
it's a moment of weakness for sure.
Absolutely, and that's the sad part. I know we had a few chapters there. By the way, Pastor Laramie is still working on that video. Life has been quite crazy for them right now, but we will get that to you sooner rather than later, covering chapters 6 through 10. Those are really the good years for David. And so it may, well, because we haven't talked about it, you may think, wow, it's just been sad. David had some good years, but it didn't last very long. And we've spent many more chapters detailing the downfall of David and what happened as a result of his sin, the consequences of that. Well, there at the end of verse 8, 2 Samuel 19, verse 8, it says, now Israel had fled every man to his own home. So you remember, that's the phrase back in chapter 18. I told you we're going to come back to that. So we've had Absalom's dead, and we've looked over here, and here's what happens when David finds out about it. Now we're kind of shifting back. The battle's over. Everybody's going home. And it becomes very evident that there's great division in the kingdom. Think about it. Some of these tribes, 12 tribes of Israel, some of these tribes have said, yeah, we'll take Absalom. We're going to follow Absalom. And others, Judah has remained loyal, but then even they turned in some sense. And so you got these rebellious tribes who are asking the question, hey, the guy that we wanted to be king, he's dead. So what are we going to do? Are we going to turn and bring David back as king? So they say there, the king delivered us, verse 9, from the hand of our enemies. He saved us from the hand of the Philistines, and now he has fled out of the land from Absalom. But Absalom, who we anointed over us, he's dead in battle. Therefore, why do you say nothing about bringing the king back? Well, at the top of verse 9, as it introduced that quote, it said, throughout all the tribes of Israel. Now, anytime we're in the Old Testament, we've got to stop and think, is Israel referring to the whole nation, or is it referring to certain tribes of the nation? We know after Solomon is king, and after the kingdom divides completely, that you have the 10 northern tribes, and they're referred to as Israel. And you have Judah in the south, and one other tribe, you have the division there. And so they're often referred to as Judah. So we have to stop and think, is Israel the whole nation, or is it part of the nation? Here, we've got hints that these divisions are already there. Because in verse 9 it talks about Israel, but in verse 11 it says, say to the elders of Judah. So you've got these divisions already going on, Judah versus all the other tribes. Now Judah was the first tribe to anoint David. You may remember that way back, I think it's in chapter 2 or chapter 4 of 2 Samuel. They were the first to get on board with David being king, the tribe of Judah. And so David sends word through Zadok and Abiathar the priest in verse 11. He sends word to Judah, you were the first to anoint me. Are you going to be the first to return to me as king. Why should you be the last to bring the king back to his house when the word of all Israel has come to the king? So you've got these factions. Israel, the other tribes are saying, yeah, we probably should take David back because, we tried to go with Absalom. That didn't turn out too well. So let's bring David back as king. And David is sending word to Judah, hey, y'all don't want to be last on this. You need to bring me back as king as well. So we would think, well, Absalom's dead. Clearly, David is king. But if the people aren't united behind him, as clearly they weren't, they rebelled against him, it's not an easy road back to, we would say the White House, but back to the king's house in Jerusalem. And so David is trying
a lot
to...
of people killed opposing him. And you have a lot of families with dead sons and etc. fathers. I wouldn't be real excited about taking him back.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so he's trying to bring these people together. In verse 12, he says, you are my brothers, you are my bone and my flesh. Why then should you be the last to bring back the king? And then he sends this word also. He says, say to Amasa, are you not my bone and my flesh? Now, that means, you hear that, bone and flesh, that's family. So once again, we have a nephew. But he's saying that Joab is not going to be commander. Amasa was Absalom's commander. We talked about that. And so David's saying, I'm not putting Joab back in charge as commander of the armies. I'm keeping Amasa as commander of the armies. So you might say perhaps that's a bit of reconciliation. That's him trying to appease these tribes who may have those hurt feelings and say, well, look, the general that you wanted to follow, he's staying in charge. And so maybe that's trying to win them over. But you can also understand David's done with Joab. Joab has killed his son, and while he's not explicitly punished for that, at least right now, he is removed as commander of the armies. Continuing in verse 13, David is sending this word to the elders of Judah. God do so to me and more also, if you, Amasa, are not commander of the army from now on in place of Joab. And so verse 14, he, that is David, swayed the heart of all the men of Judah as one man, so that they sent word to the king, return both you and all your servants. So whatever was going on in David's mind, it works. He has got the people of Judah to support him. The tribes of Israel are supporting him, at least so it seems. And so verse 15, the king came back to the Jordan River, and Judah came down to Gilgal to meet the king and to bring the king over the Jordan. Well, as they're at the Jordan, you could title this next section "Down by the Riverside," because he's going to see some different people from his past. They just start popping up all over again. First, in verses 16 and following, you get Shimei. You remember him? He's in Saul's family, and he's the one who was cursing David every step of the way while they were trying to flee. But he's not alone. Verse 17 says he has 1,000 men from the tribe of Benjamin with him. And Ziba, that's Mephibosheth's servant, he's coming with his sons and servants. Everybody's coming to the Jordan River to talk to David. But the focus here is on Shimei. And Shimei, he says, verse 19, let not my Lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day the Lord my king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart. Verse 20, for your servant knows that I have sinned. And therefore, behold, I have come this day, the first of all the house of Joseph, to come down to meet my Lord the king. It seems when he says house of Joseph, you remember that's not one of the tribes. Joseph's, his inheritance was divided between his two sons. And so when he's referring to the house of Joseph, he seems to be saying all those northern tribes. He's saying, look, I'm the first one of all these people who've come to welcome you as king. I know that I've sinned, David. Please forgive me. I'm here to submit to you and welcome you as king. Well, there's Abishai.
He tried to save his life, that's all.
Well, absolutely. Fidel says, I'm not buying it. I don't think he's sincere at all. Yeah.
He was in big trouble.
Yeah. He's trying to save his skin. Well, there's somebody who doesn't want to let his skin be saved. Verse 21, there's Abishai again. Abishai just always steps in. He's always in the shadows, and he pops right in, and he always wants to kill somebody. Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered, shall not Shimei be put to death for this, because he cursed the Lord's anointed? So you remember Abishai, he wanted to take off his head. Why let this dead dog curse you? And one of my professors in seminary, when he would talk about this, he laughed because, he's calling Shimei a dead dog, but of course he wasn't dead yet. Abishai just wanted to make him a dead dog. But Abishai is saying, look, he should be put to death for this. He cursed the Lord's anointed. But David's response, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? I think that's the exact same thing he said a few chapters back when Abishai wanted to kill Shimei. So what do I have to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? It seems to be a way of, why are you people causing me these troubles? Because again, they're family, and maybe you have some family members like that. Every time they show up, they just cause trouble. Maybe that's just me, I don't know. But what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? He said this is to be a day of rejoicing, not a day of retribution. For do I not know that I am this day king over Israel? He's saying, my kingship is secure. Why ruin this day with retribution? Verse 23, the king says to Shimei, you shall not die. And the king gave his oath. Well, this is another one of those open-ended statements, because David says to him, he promises to him, he gives him an oath, you shall not die. But I can't help but wonder if the understood emphasis was, you will not die this day. You're not going to die today. Because if you fast forwarded to 1 Kings chapter 2, which really gives us David's last days, and speaking to Solomon, who he knows is about to become king, David starts settling some scores, and he tells Solomon to include Shimei in that list of people that he needs to deal with. And so David says, you will not die, but it seems like it's a little open-ended. You're not going to die today, perhaps. Well, that's what happened with Shimei, but we're still down by the Jordan River, and here comes Mephibosheth. Now, we remember he's Saul's grandson, Jonathan's son. He's the one who's crippled and lame, and David showed great mercy to him, but his servant Ziba showed up and said, look, Mephibosheth thinks he's going to be king. He thinks Absalom is going to give him the kingdom back. He's not here to serve you. And now here he is. Here comes Mephibosheth. And the rest of verse 24 is kind of a parenthesis. It's letting you know he had neither taken care of his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed until the day he came back in safety. Now that just sounds really gross to us, but that's a sign of mourning. He's saying, look, I'm in deep grief while David, my king, is gone. And so he comes to Jerusalem, Mephibosheth does, to meet the king. David says to him, why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth? And Mephibosheth starts answering, and he says, look, my lord the king, my servant, Ziba, he deceived me. Now remember back in verse 17, we were talking about Shimei, but then it said, and there came Ziba as well. Ziba's here. You can just imagine the look on Ziba's face as Mephibosheth starts telling his side of the story. He says that Mephibosheth came to him and said, I will saddle a donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go with the king, for your servant is lame. He has slandered your servant to my lord the king, but my lord the king is like the angel of God. Mephibosheth just goes on, and he's essentially pleading for mercy and saying, hey, I really love you, David, and you've been lied to. Ziba has lied to you. Well, what do you think, Fidel? Are you buying what Mephibosheth says? Maybe this is another example of somebody else trying to save their skin. It seems like verse 29, David really isn't sure. He says, why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziba shall divide the land.
The problem is you don't see the result in the scriptures.
You don't see it resolved in the scriptures?
Yeah.
Right.
This guy.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we're told anything else about Ziba and Mephibosheth. I would have to check on that, but it seems like David is saying, I'm not really sure either. I'm not sure who's telling the truth. You've both given me your side of the story. Mephibosheth had been given all this stuff from David, and then David gave it to Ziba, and now he's saying, I don't really want to hear it. I don't want to deal with you people anymore. I'm just going to divide it in half. You take it in half. But we get a hint about it from verse 30, because Mephibosheth says to the king, "Oh, let him take it all, since my lord the king has come safely home." Perhaps Mephibosheth is being truthful. He knows the grace that David has shown to him. He's not worried about the land. He's just worried about the loyalty of David.
Yeah.
And so perhaps he's the one being...
If he wasn't.
Yeah. It's hard to tell.
Yeah.
Because it sounds, I mean, you just read some of the details and you think, well, I don't know, David already knew some of that. It sounds like maybe he's laying it on a little thick. I'm not sure. Well, that was Mephibosheth. Verse 31 down through 40, you've got this guy, Barzillai. Barzillai. Verse 32 gives you a good summary of who he is. Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old. My apologies to you who are past 80. He was a very aged man, and he had provided the king with food while he stayed at Mahanaim, for he was a very wealthy man. So he's that guy that gave that list of all that stuff a few chapters back. And remember, that came to David and his men at a very important time. They're fleeing for their life, and they need resources. And so Barzillai is the one who provided it, because he's very rich, very wealthy. And so David is so grateful, and he says, well, look, come with me, and I will provide for you with me in Jerusalem. He's essentially saying, come live with me. Stay the rest of your days with me in Jerusalem. But Barzillai says, look, I really don't know how long I have to live. I would rather just stay at home. That's the long and the short of it. Verses 34, 35. He's saying, I would really just rather stay with my own people. Verse 37, please let your servant return, that I may die in my own city, near the grave of my father and my mother. He says, but here is your servant Chimham. Now, we're not for sure, but that's probably Barzillai's son. He's saying, look, if you want to bless me, here's my son. He will serve you. You can bless him. Let him go over with my lord the king, and do for him whatever seems good to you. The king answers, verse 38, Chimham shall go over with me, and I will do for him whatever seems good to you, and all that you desire of me I will do for you. Verse 39, then all the people went over the Jordan, and the king went over. The king David, he kissed Barzillai and blessed him, and he returned to his own home. So you have here, down by the Jordan River, you have Shimei, who clearly cursed David, and he's been dealt with. And then Mephibosheth, who we're not really sure if he was cursing or not cursing David, and he's been dealt with. And now Barzillai was clearly blessing David, and he also has been dealt with. And so, in one sense, you could call all of this the return of the king. He's got to return and make it back to Jerusalem and start serving as king again. And so verse 40, the king went on to Gilgal, and Chimham went on with him, all the people of Judah, and also half the people of Israel. There's a really clear example of showing you how it's referring to different tribes. All the people of Judah and also half the people of Israel brought the king on his way. So you're getting more united, but it's not total unity. Not everybody is still united around David. Well, verses 41 through 43, the end of the chapter, shows you that there's still division. When the men of Judah take David across the Jordan River, the men of Israel, they get mad about it. Apparently they didn't get the memo, they didn't hear the bugle blow, I don't know, but they didn't come. And so the men of Judah have taken David across the river, and the men of Israel, verse 41, they come and they say, why have our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away? Why have they kidnapped you, David, and brought the king and his household over the Jordan, and all David's men with him? So they get really mad about it all, and you can just hear these tribes squabbling. It's like a family feud. And so the men of Judah say in verse 42, well, it's because he's our close relative. He's our family. But by the way, Israel, we haven't abused our relationship with the king. They're jabbing them about the way that they treated Saul and how Saul gave them favors and gave them gifts and all this stuff. And the men of Judah say, have we eaten at the king's expense? Has he given us any gift? We haven't abused our relationship with the king. And so this goes on back and forth. And you see the last line of the chapter. The words of the men of Judah were fiercer than the words of the men of Israel. So we understand there's still division in the kingdom. Verse 20 wraps it all up, and I think we can make our way through it relatively easily. We see that division leads to rebellion. Verse 1. Now there happened to be there a worthless man. A worthless man. We've seen worthless men all the way back since the beginning of 1 Samuel with Eli's son. There happened to be a worthless man whose name was Sheba, the son of Bichri, a Benjaminite. That means he's part of Saul's tribe. So here comes Saul's people again. This man named Sheba, we don't know anything about him, else about him, but he blows the trumpet. He says, we have no portion in David. We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. Every man to his tents, O Israel. He said, we don't have a share with David, no inheritance. We're being cut out. So everybody to his own tents. And these words will actually be repeated later when the nation fully divides after the death of Solomon. Well, verse 2 is all the men of Israel withdraw, and they follow Sheba. But the men of Judah follow David, their king, steadfastly from the Jordan to Jerusalem. Verse 3 tells you that David comes home, and he deals with these concubines. Remember, he left 10 women, 10 concubines in charge of his house in Jerusalem. And then Absalom, based off of Ahithophel's advice, he had gone in and had sex with all of these concubines. And so David comes home. He doesn't get rid of them. He doesn't mistreat them. He doesn't take them in for his own pleasure. He cares for them and he respects them. He sets them apart for the rest of their lives, and he provides for them and takes care of them. But then, verse 4, the scene shifts. The king says to Amasa, call the men of Judah here. He's basically saying, assemble your army in 3 days. And you can imagine that's not a long time to assemble an army. But that's the deadline that David has given him. And so Amasa goes to do that, verse 5, but he's delayed beyond the set time. He can't get it done in that amount of time. And so David then shifts his attention to Abishai. Remember, that's Joab's brother, the one who keeps wanting to chop off heads. And he says to Abishai, look, Sheba is going to hurt us more than Absalom would. So Abishai, you need to go get an army and do that. And so that's what's happening there. But you see down in verse 8, look, when they were at the great stone that is in Gibeon, Amasa came to meet them. Now Joab was wearing a soldier's garment, and over it was a belt with a sword in its sheath fastened on his thigh. And as he went forward, it fell out. So he drops the sword on the ground. About the time his cousin Amasa shows up, but they're feuding cousins. They're not happy with one another. But Joab is pretending to be nice. He says, "Is it well with you, my brother?" So Joab takes Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. All that sounds weird to us, but that was their custom, so that's what he's doing. He looks like he's coming in for a hug, but Amasa didn't notice that Joab had a sword, and Joab struck him with it in the stomach and spilled his entrails to the ground without striking a second blow, and he died. So Joab has killed Abner, way back. He's killed Absalom. He's killed Amasa. This is why I'm saying Joab has a little bit too much power. He kills whoever he wants to kill. He kills whoever gets in his way. And think about this. David's army has just seen Joab kill this man in cold blood, and they all follow Joab without batting an eye. That's how influential and how powerful he is. He's killed Amasa, the one that David had put in charge of the army. Remember, Joab was replaced by this man. And Joab has his opportunity to kill him, and he does it. And the army doesn't say, wait now. This is not David's plan. They say, okay, we'll follow you. Maybe they're afraid. I don't know. I think it points to his influence, the power and influence he has there in Israel. So they all start to follow Joab. They're chasing Sheba, and they come to this city. We're going to move a little quickly through this, but they get to this city where he's at, and they're starting to batter the walls, attack the city. But then verse 16, a wise woman calls from the city. And she says, listen, tell Joab, come here. And so she starts having this conversation with Joab. And she reminds him, verse 19, I'm one of those who are peaceable and faithful in Israel. And you're here to destroy a city. And why would you swallow up the heritage of the Lord? Now, verse 20, Joab starts his response and says, oh, no, far be it from me that I should swallow up or destroy. And he starts defending himself and essentially says, hey, I'm only here after Sheba. But now you got to think, he's acting like he's just this noble do-gooder. Man's got a trail of blood right out there on the road where he's killing people. But he says, I'm only after Sheba. And so if you give us Sheba, we will leave you alone. So the wise woman, her solution is, behold, his head shall be thrown over the wall to you. So she goes and tells the people of the city, And they cut off the head of Sheba and they throw it over to Joab. And so once again, Joab blows that trumpet, letting people know the battle is over. They disperse from his city and every man to his own home. And then it says Joab returned to Jerusalem to the king. But David can't punish Joab for what he's done. Joab is a loose cannon. He does whatever he wants. And David really can't do anything about it. Well, verses 23 through 26 really end this main portion of the book. And they're actually kind of a repetition from back in chapter 8. It's that boring bureaucratic stuff that we don't like to pay attention to, where it says, here's who was in charge of this, here was in charge of that, all that sort of stuff. But there's one addition here, verse 24. It talks about someone, Adoram, being in charge of the forced labor. That wasn't mentioned earlier in David's reign, but that's come to take place later in his reign. But you just get this kind of bureaucratic summary, and that's kind of the end of David's story. Everything else is an epilogue. We'll talk about that next time. It's like the appendix at the back of the book. But you get to the end of this, and you're just kind of, we're conditioned, we're waiting for somebody to say they all lived happily ever after. But we understand that's not how the story ends. We could have spent a great deal more time looking at David's life and his reign, and there's so many things along the way that point us to Christ in the life of David. But as we've taken this big picture look, and we've seen how severe the consequences have been in David's life, we've followed him in 1 Samuel all the way from Samuel up through Saul, and we're waiting for this king, and we've heard the promises to this king, and we think, oh, this is going to be great. David, he sounds like the guy. This is all going to be wonderful. And for those few chapters in there, everything was going so well. David was rightly focused on the right worship of God and serving the people as God had commanded. This is the guy. And then the last 10 chapters have just been consequence after consequence, bloodshed after bloodshed. And we realize that this king, he can't unite his kingdom. He doesn't have a united nations there in Israel. Things aren't going the way that the people would want them to go. They're not united. And we look at history and we understand no king has ever been able to do that. When we look at this kingdom, it should leave us longing for the true king. It should leave us longing for Jesus, who will actually rule and reign perfectly. There's like I say, so many points along the way we could have pointed out the connections to Christ and how Christ is the perfect one. He's the one who rules and reigns rightly. At the end of chapter 18, when David is mourning for his son Absalom, and he mourns and he says, "Would that I had died instead of you." David knows that his sins are the reason all of this has happened. But Jesus, the true king, he's committed no sin, but he's taken our sins upon himself so that we can be in relationship with him. And so as we come to the conclusion of this portion of it, we should be longing for Jesus, the true king, the one who will unite the people, the one who will rule and reign rightly and justly, and will do all things perfectly. Well, as I said, the next time we're together, whether it's on video or in person, we'll have this epilogue. Chapters 21 through 24 kind of are the final verdict on how we should view David as king. They're organized very well. The writer of the book has put these things here for a purpose. And so we'll see David negatively, and then we'll see him positively there in 21 through 24. And depending on our time, I very well may mention 1 Kings chapter 1 and 2, because that really gives you the end of David's life, his death, and the passing of the torch to Solomon. So if you have opportunity to look ahead at that, feel free to do so. I will pray for us, and if you have questions or want to talk, I'm happy to do that. But as we can tell, the women and children are ready to be done. And so feel free to go or hang around and talk either way. Lord, we're so grateful for your word. These stories are riveting, but we understand that they're true. They're far greater than any movie or novel, because every bit of it is true. And Lord, you are working and orchestrating behind the scenes of all of this in ways that we can't even fully comprehend. How human actors who have the ability to make these decisions, they do all of these things, yet you're working above and beyond all of that for your glory and for our good, Lord. And you worked through the life of a very flawed man like David, and ultimately through him you brought about your perfect Son, Jesus Christ. Lord, as we have even moved very quickly through the book of Samuel, Lord, we've seen so many points along the way that we recognize this is not the way things are supposed to be. And it helps us when we look at Jesus that we can say, this is your Son. This is the way you have designed it. Lord, may we all seek to love Christ even more faithfully because of what you've shown us through your word. Give us wisdom that we might glean from some of the foolish decisions of David and others, that we might walk more wisely. But ultimately, we know that the only hope that we have is what Christ has done for us. And so we praise you for that. And we thank you for the time to gather together as men to study your word. We pray that you would bless those who couldn't be here tonight, Lord. We pray that you would bring us all together again very soon. It's in Jesus' name we pray.